At 1:15 hours on February 28, 2026, the most concentrated American air armada, assembled since the Iraq War, crossed into Iranian airspace simultaneously from 6 directions. No warning, no ultimatum, no final diplomatic cable. Just the cold opening note of a military campaign that the Pentagon had been wargaming for 30 years. Within the first 90 minutes, Iran's integrated air defense network, the system designed to make all of this impossible, began going dark. Radar by radar, battery by battery. The silence that followed wasn't peace, it was the sound of an air force being erased. This is the story of how Operation Epic Fury destroyed the Iranian Air Force in under 1 week. Not degraded it, not suppressed it, destroyed it. And how the military that spent decades building the most sophisticated asymmetric defense architecture in the Middle East watched that architecture collapse before its pilots could even reach their aircraft. To understand what happened, you need to understand what Iran was working with going in. Because the story of Iran's Air Force isn't a story of power. It's a story of decay, dressed up as deterrence. Decades of American and European sanctions had left Tehran's fighter fleet in a state of controlled disintegration. F-4 Phantoms, jets that first flew in 1958 and were already obsolete when Iran acquired them before the revolution. F-5 Tigers, F-14, Tomcats that hadn't received American spare parts since 1979 and were held together through improvisation and reverse engineering. MiG-29s, Su-24s, Fencers, Mirage F-1s, a museum collection of Cold War steel that Iranian engineers had kept airworthy through sheer ingenuity and desperation. The newest fixed-wing aircraft in the entire fleet were Yak 130 advanced trainers delivered by Russia starting in 2023. That was the cutting edge of Iranian air power in 2026. A training jet. Pentagon planners had a phrase for Iran's Air Force: built for 1996, maintained through prayers, destroyed in 2026. The operation that ended it began not with aircraft, but with B-2 Spirit stealth bombers flying from Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri. 18 hours in the air. Each B-2 carrying GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrators, 30,000-pound bunker busters, designed specifically for the hardened underground facilities Iran had spent billions constructing. The first strikes targeted Iran's integrated air defense system, the S-300 batteries, the radar arrays, the command and control nodes that tied every surface-to-air missile site in the country into a single coordinated network. Without that network, individual missile batteries would be fighting blind. Iran's air defense wasn't just degraded in the opening minutes, it was lobotomized. While the B-2S worked at altitude, F-22 Raptors and F-35C, Lightning IIs operating from 3 carrier strike groups in the Arabian Sea, crossed the coastline in radio silence. Their mission was the airfields. Every major Iranian airbase from Tabriz in the northwest to Bandar Abbas in the south had been preloaded as a target. The logic was brutal and simple. An aircraft on the ground cannot intercept. An aircraft destroyed on the ramp cannot ever intercept. The Iranians had dispersed some of their jets into hardened shelters, concrete bunkers designed to survive near misses. The F-35 doesn't require a direct hit. Its precision-guided munitions collapse the entrance of a hardened shelter, entombing whatever is inside. Israeli surveillance footage released 48 hours after the opening strikes showed the results at Tabriz Air Base. F-4 Phantoms and F-5 Tigers lined up on the ramp, apparently preparing to launch, caught by the first wave before their engines reached operating temperature. The jets weren't destroyed in air combat. They were destroyed in place, burning on the concrete where they'd been parked. Israel released that footage with a single caption: "They never got off the ground." By hour 36, something unprecedented happened in the skies over Tehran. Iran attempted to use what was left of its air force to intercept incoming munitions over the capital. Yak-130 trainers and MiG-29s were scrambled, flying over a city that was simultaneously being struck from multiple directions. It was a desperate act. Flying manned aircraft into an airspace controlled by American F-22s and Israeli F-35s, while the ground below is already on fire. Military analysts watching the radar feeds described it as walking into a buzzsaw while on fire. The Israeli Air Force F-35I, call sign Adir, engaged an Iranian Yak-130 over Tehran. One radar-guided missile, one target. The Yak-130 was gone before its pilot could react. It was the first confirmed air-to-air kill ever recorded by an F-35 in combat. The first time in more than 40 years that the Israeli Air Force had shot down a manned aircraft. Iranian state television reported a great defensive victory. The pilot was already dead. Then came the moment nobody saw coming. Not Iran, not American planners, not the international analysts tracking the engagement in real time. Qatar announced that its air force had engaged and destroyed two Iranian Su-24 Fencer strike aircraft attempting to transit Qatari airspace. Qatar, a country that hosts the Combined Air Operations Center at Al Udeid Air Base, a country that had watched American aircraft launch from its territory for the past week. When even Qatar is shooting down your jets, your Air Force has ceased to function as a coherent military instrument. By day 5 of Operation Epic Fury, American B-52 Stratofortresses entered the campaign. The B-52 is not a stealth aircraft. It doesn't need to be stealth when the country below it has no functioning air defense network left to target it. B-52s struck Iranian ballistic missile sites and command and control infrastructure in broad daylight. The aircraft that once required suppression of enemy air defenses before it could operate anywhere near a contested zone was now orbiting Iranian airspace with the same operational freedom it enjoys over Kansas. That image, a B-52 operating freely over Iran, tells you everything you need to know about the state of Iranian air defenses by the end of the first week. The numbers from the Pentagon briefing were clinical. Over 1,700 targets struck in the first 48 hours alone. Ballistic missile attacks against American forces and regional partners down 90% from day 1. Drone attacks down 83%. The operational capacity that Iran had spent 3 decades building, the missile arsenals, the drone stockpiles, the layered air defense architecture, was being consumed faster than it could be reconstituted. Iranian generals who had drilled their forces on the assumption that geography and numbers would compensate for technological inferiority were discovering that the calculus had changed. Precision engagement doesn't care about mountains. Stealth aircraft don't care about numbers of radar operators if the radars are already burning. On the ground in Tehran, the silence from the airfields was deafening. Iranian pilots who had spent careers training for this moment found themselves with aircraft they couldn't safely fly into an airspace controlled entirely by the enemy and ground-based air defenses that had been systematically removed over the previous 6 days. The Iranian Air Force didn't surrender. It simply ran out of options one layer at a time until there were no layers left. The final accounting came in a Pentagon briefing delivered with the quiet confidence of people who had done exactly what they said they would do. The Iranian Air Force, F-4s, F-5s, F-14, Su-22s, Su-24s, MiG-29s, Yak-130. All of it neutralized as a functional fighting force. Not through a single dramatic engagement. Through systematic, methodical, around-the-clock strikes against every element of the infrastructure required to generate, sustain, and protect combat air operations. The jets that survived the initial strikes couldn't fly, because the fuel infrastructure was gone. The jets that could reach fuel couldn't launch because the runways were cratered. The jets that could reach a serviceable runway couldn't survive the airspace because the men trained to fly them understood what had happened to every Iranian pilot who had tried. Built for 1996. Destroyed in 2026. Sometimes the most terrifying military verdict isn't delivered with a single overwhelming strike. It's delivered with 30 years of planning, 6 days of execution, and a B-52 flying circles over your capital in daylight because there is nothing left to stop it. If you found this breakdown valuable, subscribe and share. The stories that define the future rarely make the front page before history has already been written.